I've heard some big talkers and I've heard some fat whoppers in my day, stories and claims that just could possibly not be true. And yet, some people will still try to sell you a piece of the Brooklyn Bridge. At least they used to a long time ago. Scams these days are digital, but the foundation is the same. Somebody wants to fool someone else and end up with all their money or power over them or something. And when you talk about frauds or scams or deception, some people will turn their thoughts to religion. And sure, religion is a vehicle for some shady people to get something from innocent people, and I hate that as much as anybody else, but I'm not blaming my cell phone or the internet service providers just because people use those things to try and scam me, like all the time. We used to say that's throwing the baby out with the bath water. I think also when you talk about religion that it's kind of hard to pick a bone with Jesus in particular. You might disagree with what he had to say or what he stood for as far as morality and purity, but as far as I can tell, Jesus is the one person who always backed up his words. And he talked a pretty big game. Like he said this in John 11, I am the resurrection and the life. Anyone who believes in me even will live even after dying. Everyone who lives in me and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this, Martha? See, lots of people right there would scoff and walk away like, are you kidding me? But then Jesus went on to prove it. You've probably heard about Lazarus. Jesus was friends with Mary and Martha and their brother Lazarus. And Lazarus had died 4 days ago. Jesus came to do something about it, came to visit the family. And this is where we're in the middle of this conversation where he's talking with Mary, and he says these things. Well, he says that, and then later he went to the tomb, John 11:38. Jesus was still angry as he arrived at the tomb. A cave with a stone rolled across its entrance. Roll aside the stone, Jesus told them. But Martha, the dead man's sister, protested. Lord, he's been dead for 4 days. The smell is going to be terrible. Jesus responded, didn't I tell you you would see God's glory if you believe? So they rolled aside the stone. Then Jesus looked up to heaven and said, Father, thank you for hearing me. You always hear me, but I said it out loud for the sake of these people standing here, so that they will believe that you sent me. Then Jesus shouted, Lazarus, come out. And the dead man came out, his hands and feet bound in grave clothes, his face wrapped in a headcloth. Jesus told them, unwrap him and let him go. Jesus backed it up. I am the resurrection and the life. Anyone who believes in me will live even after dying. And here's proof of the concept. I can so raise people from the dead. It's recorded a few times in the New Testament where Jesus raised people from the dead. And it isn't something brand new, this idea of resurrection. I just want to kind of back up a little bit. And in the Old Testament, the prophets also had performed those feats. And so you might ask, well, how is Jesus different? Like maybe he's just a prophet, right? Some of these other guys did that too. Well, Martha was having a talk with Jesus when he arrived, as I said. Martha said to Jesus, Lord, if only you'd been here, my brother wouldn't have died. But even now, I know God will give you whatever you ask. Jesus told her, your brother will rise again. Yes, Martha said, he will rise when everyone else rises at the last day. Martha's response shows that she was familiar with the doctrine of resurrection from the dead. Like I said, could be an Old Testament prophet, no big deal, but not anything extra special, maybe we could say. In Genesis 22, we have the example, like as early as Genesis 22, we have an example of this obvious belief in the resurrection of the dead. The account of Abraham and Isaac, and Abraham being willing at God's command to sacrifice his son, and then God saying don't do that and providing a sacrifice. But it doesn't really tell us in Genesis 22 why Abraham was willing to do that, but in Hebrews 11 it gives us an explanation. It says Abraham reasoned that if Isaac died, God was able to bring him back to life again. And in a sense, Abraham did receive his son back from the dead. There's some people that believe in an afterlife, but it's a spiritual thing that there's no bodies, just spirits. We pass to the great beyond or something, and we're somehow changed or something, or just our spirit survives. And they extend that to Jesus, that he's a spirit being without a body and therefore could appear in any body. And that leads to all kinds of ideas about who Jesus is and when he returns and if he's already returned and things of that nature. But what we see here in the Old Testament is that they already had a belief or a teaching that there was a bodily resurrection, because Abraham couldn't have been confident in his line continuing, right? Like the promise to Abraham was that he would have heirs through Isaac. And the only way that could happen, if Abraham was going to sacrifice him and believed he'd rise again, is that Isaac rose again. Same Isaac, same body to carry on his line. The teaching that's new in Jesus is this. He said, I am the resurrection and life. I am. So we have the I am statement, the resurrection and life. Anyone who believes in me will live, even after dying. Everyone who lives in me and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this, Martha? Jesus is thrusting himself into the very center of it. It's not just that there will be a resurrection on the last day, or that we're eternal spirits and we all survive somehow in some kind of spirit form, but that there is no resurrection apart from Jesus Christ on the last day. He's the one who makes the resurrection possible. He is the resurrection. Preacher's Commentary says, resurrection, the defeat of death, is an event, a reality within Jesus, who is life. It's impossible for death to prevail in his presence. And this is not a concept or a doctrine, but a personal reality. I like the way they phrase that. This is a personal reality of Jesus Christ. This is who he is. I am the resurrection and the life. And again, I refer to Hebrews, where it says that Jesus is a priest forever, not because of a lineage or because of the law, but because he has the power of a life that cannot be destroyed. You might say he's immortal, but that isn't quite it, because he's more than that. He's not just immortal, he's beyond immortal. His life is so powerful that it imparts life to others. And I like to say that he's contagious with life, that you and I were contagious with death, to the extent that it became a worldwide phenomenon a few years back, where we're told, stay away from each other because you're contagious with death. You're going to spread death around. Jesus is the antithesis to this. When you come in contact with Jesus, you don't come in contact with death, you come in contact with life, because he is so alive that his life spills out into you. He is the source of all life. Jesus says so. I am the resurrection and the life, right now and at the end of time. Preacher's Commentary says, the one who believes in Jesus is living eternally now, as well as at the end. He'll pass through an incident called death, but he cannot die eternally because he's put his trust in the one who is life. So says Goddard, some theologian. Jesus means, therefore, in me the dead live and the living does not die. And Jesus proved this, not just by raising at least 3 people, himself raising them, but also by his own death and resurrection. In a letter to the Corinthians, Paul is underscoring how critically important the resurrection of Christ is. Like, he's almost ranting on it, and for good reason. Like, what he's saying here is absolutely true. Corinthians 15. If there's no resurrection of the dead, then Christ has not been raised either. And if Christ has not been raised, our preaching is useless. Our faith is useless, because we're basing it all on falsehood. Jesus has to be alive, or otherwise, what's the point? Not only that, and if our hope in Christ is only for this life, we're more to be pitied than anyone in the world. Than anyone in the world for Christ. But in fact, Christ has been raised from the dead. He's the first of a great harvest of all who have died. Another translation will say he's the first fruits of the resurrection. And there's 2 questions that we might have regarding this. One is, well, how do you know? Like, well, maybe, how do you know he is raised? And the second is, if he is raised, how is he the first? Because others were raised to life from death in the Old Testament and in the New Testament before Jesus was. How's he the first? How's he the first fruits of the resurrection? And those can be answered in one fact, really: eyewitnesses. First a few, then a few more, up to 500. Up to 500 people testify they saw him alive after he was put in the grave. The difference in his resurrection and the reason that he is the first is that he was raised with a glorified body. He was the first to be raised with a glorified body. And I spoke for an evening. Some guy from the Baha'i religion just called me up and wanted to do some research on me, I guess, ask me questions, see what I would say. And this is one of the main points he kept coming back to, that the idea that Jesus is a spirit and he has no body. And like I said, so he could have already returned and in a different form, in a different body. But I think the Bible is pretty clear on the fact that Jesus does indeed have a body. He has to have a body. Otherwise, these eyewitness accounts are all false, and we don't know if he's raised. The main reason we believe these people that said he's alive, I've seen him, is because they recognized him when he returned from the grave. Professor D.A. Carson Emeritus says that there's a connection between his old body, that is his pre-death body, and his resurrection body, in that the stigmata, and that's the fancy name they give for the marks on his hands, his side, possibly his brow, scars are still there. Like, everyone who saw him, as many as 500 people, recognized him. Not just when he was with him, but they recognized him as the one who had been laid in the tomb. And as I said, the stigmata, the nail marks, the spear hole, maybe the scars on his brow, all still there. The tomb was empty, and the resurrected body of Jesus is at some level the same as the body that went in. And this is the historical Jesus, the same man they knew. And yet at the same time, he's now in resurrection glory. He's in resurrection life. He does things now that he hadn't done before. Appearing in a locked room, for example, you might say materializing or dematerializing, makes me think of Star Trek. Like, beam me up, Mr. Scott. All of a sudden, you're somewhere else. And in some sense, Doctor says, he exists in another sphere. And exactly what the connection is at some scientific or ontological level between his pre-death body and his post-resurrection body, we don't really know. It's a mystery. But I say we're going to find out one day, because he's the first. It's the first of a resurrection harvest, the first fruits. And the first implies there's going to be a second and a third and a fourth. And this is what we based our faith upon. All of us who do believe in Jesus, we base our faith on these people having seen him, and even under persecution, never changing their tune. No, I saw him. Like, their conviction was solid. I saw him. It wasn't some ghost. It wasn't some twin, body double. His body's not there, right? They can't find his body because he rose. It was somehow changed, but the same, glorified. And it's the fact that he had this glorified body that finally convinces one of the most doubting of the apostles, Thomas. You're familiar with it, but I'll read it. One of the 12 disciples, Thomas, nicknamed the twin, was not with the others when Jesus came. They told him, "We've seen the Lord." And he said what probably we would all say: "No, I won't believe it unless I see him myself. And I won't believe it unless I see the nails in his hands and put my fingers in them and place my hand in the wound in his side." Like, here's a guy that's like, I'm not going to be given over to fanciful tales and just wishful thinking. I want concrete proof and evidence. I don't want some guy that just looks like Jesus. If Jesus is alive, then I want to see the scars. 8 days later, the disciples were together again, and this time Thomas was with them. The doors were locked, but suddenly, as before, Jesus was standing among them, just appeared in the room. "Peace be with you," he said. Then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here. Look at my hands. Put your hand into the wound in my side. Don't be faithless any longer. believe. And at that moment, Thomas saw something that he wanted to see. He saw Jesus. He recognized him. He saw the wounds. "My Lord and my God," Thomas exclaimed. All the followers of Christ had to wrestle with this in one way or another, and they all came to believe he is alive. It's not a ghost, some fake copied body double twin. This is Jesus. And as Paul said, if he's not alive, we're all fools. But the evidence believes us to believe it's true. And if it's true, what does that mean? It means Jesus is the real deal. It means Jesus is the resurrection and the life, and he is king right now. Professor said if Jesus really has risen from the dead, then he is approved by God. He is vindicated by God. His death was not to pay for his own sin or else he'd be dead. No, he paid for the sin of others. And his sacrifice was so acceptable in God's own plan that the vindication is demonstrated not least in the resurrection of Christ Jesus. This establishes him right now as the reigning Lord. 1 Corinthians 15. So you see, just as death came into the world through a man, now the resurrection from the dead has begun through another man. Just as everyone dies, because we all belong to Adam, everyone who belongs to Christ will be given new life. After that, the end will come. He will then turn the kingdom over to God his Father. So he already has it. He'll then turn it over to God. Having destroyed every ruler, authority, and power, for Christ must reign until he humbles all his enemies beneath his feet. Again, he's reigning right now. He's reigning right now. And the last enemy to be destroyed is death. And I felt like when I was preparing this, and I already did, but I'll do it again to emphasize this. He's reigning right now. He's king right now. We aren't going to crown him king one day. He already is king. Like, it's a nice hymn. We'll crown him Lord of all. He already is. You could better say we'll affirm, or we should change that song. He is Lord of all already. And he is already right now humbling all his enemies. And when the last enemy, death, is destroyed forever, then he'll hand the kingdom over to the Father. And that means that we also, as one verse says, have a living hope. The one who is life is alive, and so our hope lives in him. And if the Bible called him the first, again I say there must be others that follow. More people that will live again and receive a glorified body. Our ultimate hope is not simply to be with Christ in immaterial existence, some kind of spirit floating along there, but to have resurrected bodies. And I think this is one of the truly great blessings, because if you haven't got your health, what have you got, right? We say that. And it's true. Because being wealthy, it's comforting, but if you're always in pain or having trouble or your mind's going, that doesn't matter. And it's the same for heaven, I think. Streets of gold and all that, they wouldn't mean a thing if I had a dead and decaying body. But I'm going to get a new glorified body. I'm going to be me. You'll recognize me, but my shoulder won't hurt anymore. Never again. I won't get dizzy spells. Back won't ache. My knee won't give me a sharp pain when I walk up the stairs. Not just my sin paid for and forgiven, not just paradise to live in, not just every enemy destroyed, but also a glorified body that'll never decay. Sounds too good to be true, right? For some people. Fairy tale. But if you do the research, the evidence is there. The evidence is there that Jesus did what he said he would do, rise again, as himself in a glorified body. And he raised other people from the dead, and therefore, what the rest of what he said he would do is dependable. He's not a scam artist. The real deal. D.L. Moody once said, "Someday you'll read in the papers that D.L. Moody of East and Northwood is dead. Don't believe a word of it. At that moment, I shall be more alive than I am now." John 11:25. Jesus said, "I am the resurrection and the life. Anyone who believes in me will live even after dying." And Jesus' question to Martha applies to all of us. Everyone who lives in me and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this? I do. And if you do, like if you just decided you do, just ask Jesus into your heart. Say, Jesus, become my Lord and Savior. Be my resurrection and my life. And at the last day, raise me up to be with you forever. And he will. God bless you. Have a great day.